Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to see so many of you, the home team, well supplemented and complemented with visitors. My name is Shubrata Mitra. I'm the director of the South Asia Institute of South Asian Studies. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to share with you the important theme of the Modi visit to China and its dissection by 4 of our specialists. If you're wondering if I would really welcome you for 35 minutes, that's not going to be the case. There's a little mistake in the agenda that's given to you. I'll just take a couple of minutes to tell you as to why we are doing it the way we are doing it. As you might guess, for South Asia, China is a very, very important presence. And for the Institute of South Asian Studies, we try to engage China through our publications, which are of very different kinds. We ran a few articles in anticipation of the Modi visit to China, and today we have brought together our 4 specialists, Dr. Ittika Chaudhary, Dr. Amitendu Phalit, Dr. Shindapal Singh, and Mr. P.S. Suryanarayana to talk to us about what they had thought the visit would bring and what they think now. But before I do all that, if you have had a chance to look at the description of the symposium, you might have stopped at the word personal chemistry. This is how it goes. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to China in mid-May 2015 was remarkable for his personal chemistry with China's powerful president, etc., etc. So you'd stop. What a prime minister got to do with chemistry or physics or biology for that matter? So what is this chemistry? If you would write, instead of chemistry, construction, suddenly it would be elevated to something theoretical. After all, in international politics, what matters is not what is out there, but what you make out of it. So the fact that Modi, after his election, made it his business to invite all the prime ministers of South Asia and then packed his traveling kits and spent 56 days out of the first year abroad is one way of understanding how he is trying to construct India's foreign policy. This is constructivism at its best. Now the question is, does it work? Does it always work? For my generation, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai was yet another way of constructing a peaceful, cooperative relationship with India's neighbor. As all of you know, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai very quickly became Hindi Chini Bye Bye in 1962. And then, for those of us who are looking at statistics, we have noticed Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai becomes Hindi Chini Bye Bye, and now Hindi Chini Bye Bye. If you are thinking about a 4th phase, it is called Make in India. Now, Make in India will be questioning that original idea of Chindia, which was Chinese manufacture, Indian software. But if India also is beginning to or wanting to make in India, will Chindia continue? As you can see, a number of questions are emerging from this visit. What I would like very much as a political scientist is to see from our 4 authors the before-after analysis. What did they think it would bring? What did it actually bring? And then to relativize the Modi visit to China with Modi visit to the United States, Modi visit to Australia, Modi visit or visiting as a construction or reconstruction of Indian foreign policy. That bit we will leave for the discussion to follow. So once again, hearty welcome to friends from outside, hearty welcome to the home team, hearty congratulations to the 4 members of the podium. You would have between 7 to 10 minutes each. And I would like it if questions were raised, not after each lecture, but at the end. If this is all right with you all, I would look at our first speaker, Dr. Iftikhar Chaudhary. You have the floor.
Thank you, Director. What I'll do is the mic on? What I'll do is I'll look at the way the dragon, where China behaves, and the kind of matrix that Modi stepped into when he visited China. Now, in terms of methodology, the Chinese reach out into the past. They do this to shape contemporary thinking. For instance, the idea of yin and yang. In other words, the male and female forces. To the Chinese, everything in the world has two seemingly opposite elements. The quality of our lives and the well-being of our world depend on bringing such opposing tendencies into balance with one another. Yin symbolizes the moon and yang the sun. And to keep the heavens running smoothly, the emperor in ancient China had the task of maintaining this harmonious balance between the sun and the moon. With the emperor over time disappearing, this function devolved on the CCP, the Communist Party of China, representing the Chinese people who, as Mao had famously said, had stood up. But as we know, you spoke of chemistry, Director, but as we know in the fundamental laws of physics, contradictions in absolute equilibrium impede movement and thereby progress. If two things are in absolute balance, then there is no forward movement. So it is necessary to have this balance tilted in a positive way. Enter Georg Friedrich Hegel. The Hegelian dialectical progression of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis was the chosen paradigm to move forward, just like the kite rises against the wind. Now, this brought Marxism, or today's socialism with Chinese characteristics, into line with China's value system in support of the revolution. The ensuing behavior pattern, seemingly eschewed, this is very important to note, any form of stridency. For instance, contrary to expectations, China did not intervene in the 1971 South Asian War. Hence the hesitation even to accept the expression peaceful rise and use instead peaceful development to describe their current burgeoning influence. But driven by necessity, force would have to be used to restore order, whether it be in the borders with India or on the Amu Darya with Russia, or in defense of core interests. And in this, they are in consonance with the Hobbesian sense that order is the sine qua non of civilization. But even an orderly society produces waves. A good helmsman must guide the boat of society or state by using the waves. Otherwise, the waves would sink the boat. Hence, the need for the emperor, Sun Yat-sen, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, or Xi Jinping. This is roughly the philosophical or theoretical matrix which forms China's strategic goals today, and I see these goals as fivefold. First, the preservation of the CCP regime, despite remarkable changes in the governance principles. One will note this even in the latest defense white paper, where the PLA, where the People's Liberation Army, unequivocally pledges its allegiance to the party. Second, prosperity, mainly in the economic arena, that helps prop up the regime. Because the changes in the communist ideology in China, because of those, the CCP's rationale or raison d'être becomes tied to its performance. So if there is no performance, then there is no reason for the CCP to exist. Third, power, generally in the international arena, both in its hard and soft versions. Hence, the building up of military capabilities such as naval carriers, Dangfang or the East Wind missiles, and stealth submarines on the one hand, and the setting up of the Confucian institutes on the other. Fourth, a peaceful, orderly environment to sustain its reforms and modernization challenges. Now, this domestically, this includes what they call the four comprehensives. I might perhaps just rattle them off to you, but you are probably aware that these were unveiled in this February in advance of what they call the Lianghui, which is the annual pair of meeting between the National People's Congress and the People's Political Consultative Conference. And these four comprehensive domestically are comprehensively to build a moderately prosperous society, comprehensively deepen reforms, comprehensively govern according to law, and comprehensively and strictly govern the party. These are the four comprehensive. And these are taken in tandem with China's foreign policy goals, which call for actually conformity rather than challenging the international order. In other words, China somehow tends to conform to rather than challenge the existing order, and hence in the current global financial architecture, they would rather operate from within or add on institutionally, as is evident in setting up of the Asian Infrastructural Investment Fund, and my colleague Dr. Palit will, I'm sure, speak to it more. Finally, championing multipolarity and challenging the hegemony of the sole hyperpower, that is the United States, but preferring itself to be the only entity to be able to stand up to the United States in Asia. Hence, India is important, but not an equal. Because in their perception, India is not able to stand up to China, to stand up to the United States in this manner. Now, there are four contradictions that condition China's pursuit of the above-mentioned strategies. First, the self-image of a big power versus existing poverty. They still like to say they are a developing country, a very large country, but the world's largest developing country. Second, open-door incentives versus sovereignty concerns, which makes them reject interference. Third, principles versus pragmatism, which makes for strong rhetorics but restrained action. For instance, when there were clashes with Myanmar, for instance, soldiers, surprisingly, there was no Chinese retaliation. Somewhat in contrast with what we saw in Manipur, Indian action yesterday when they went into Myanmar in retaliation. And finally, market socialism versus Leninist command economy. Now, there is, of course, in this competition with the United States, but there is also tremendous involvement, unlike what we saw in the case of the Soviet, during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. $3.9 trillion in US Treasury bonds. There is a sort of a MAD principle involved also, like mutually assured destruction, as in the Soviet American strategic or nuclear this thing. But this MAD is mutually assured damage in the economic sphere should there be a conflict situation. Now, the Chinese, as we all know, express themselves in metaphors and maxims. Deng's methodology was hide your capabilities and bide your time. But he was very, very strong in pragmatism, for instance, when he said it does not matter whether the cat is black or white, so long as it catches mouse. So go to the marketplace. But remember that there are no friends in the marketplace, so you build allies and nurture allies. So you do these two things at the same time. You go into market, you take your allies with you. So operate in a sort of a comprehensive way. She launched a new mantra, and which is what they call the Chung Gomang, the China Dream, which has three elements. One, a new kind of big power relationship with the United States, one that is of equality, but it isn't my way or the highway. It is, you go your way and I go mine. We go together, we go separately, but we go in peace. This is the same kind of big power relationship in its simplest expression. Two, win-win relationship with partners, whether they be competitive entities like India or strategic allies like Pakistan. And Pakistan, as you know, is key in the fruition of Xi's One Belt, One Road initiative, which also involves a massive infrastructural investment of nearly $45 billion along the Sino-Pakistan economic corridor. Now, when China invests like that, it claims that these investments are actually parts of community development and does not take into cognizance territorial disputes between states, because some of these are through disputed Kashmir territory, but China says that they have nothing to do with a position on the territorial disputes per se. And third, the stimulating local demand through boosting the economy, which is a domestic initiative. Andre Gunder Frank had once stated that the only thing to fear about rising China was the US response to it. The historian Neil Ferguson had coined the term chimerica to describe the duo, and Brzezinski had floated the concept of G2, which, by the way, both the United States and China are wary of. Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister, has spoken of an asymmetric balance, a military one in favor of the United States and economic in favor of China. The US rebalance may have an element of containment of China, but many Americans see what they call constrainment, which is containment plus engagement. I must say that my young colleague and aide Raman and I today looked at the dictionary to sort of look at the differences between constrainment and containment. And constrain and contain in English are almost synonyms, but they see a very, very nuanced difference between the two. Constraining being a softer way of restraining than containment. Jeffrey Sachs. To Jeffrey Sachs, China is the most successful development story in history. But the Chinese appear almost demure about it. At the same time, make no mistake, China is quietly moving to position itself in the globe. Its external policy resembles a river that meanders but does not suddenly change course. This is the complex milieu into which Modi stepped. And because of the reasons described, he confronted the maxim, shelve differences and find common grounds. China believes time is on its side and time is not of the essence. Once asked about the impact on history of the French Revolution of 1789, Zhou Enlai famously replied, it is too soon to tell. I thank you.
Dr. Chaudhary, thank you very much for those insightful comments. With your long engagement with diplomacy as ambassador, active member of the United Nations and minister, and the world of scholarship in terms of your PhD, you are a valuable presence amongst us. I'm sure there'll be many, many questions to follow up. I certainly will ask if yang and yin is a once for all relationship, or if yang can become yin and yin can become yang. But about that later. I will now invite Dr. Amitandu Phalit, well known to the national audience and to the global audience as the economic face of ISAS. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitra. It's all right. I will try to focus on three specific aspects of the visit. The first is the economic context of the visit in which it took place. It was an expected visit. The second is whether the context and the expectations from that context actually materialized during the visit. And the third is that if we take this visit as part of a sequence of the economics that is critical to Modi's foreign policy, then what kind of a direction does it point to? This visit was actually unique in a particular sense. It was unique because it was for the first time in this century that an Indian Prime Minister was visiting China with the knowledge that the year is likely to end with India achieving a higher rate of growth than China. This had never happened in this century earlier. China has been slowing. India, notwithstanding the confusion created by the new GDP figures, is actually poised to achieve a rate of growth in the current year, which will be as much as that of China or a little more. And that is a rate of growth which is expected to continue for the next 3 years at least, according to the projections of the IMF and the World Bank. Now, this put Mr. Modi in a position where he could have had, and he probably had, we will see those results down the line, a bit of an upper hand in negotiations. Now, what could that have led to? Before that, let's just look at the Chinese economy very briefly, and what does a slowdown mean for the Chinese economy? It's a controlled slowdown. The growth rate is coming down in sort of a calibrated fashion, which is very characteristic of the Chinese economy. This is in line with the new normal, which has been defined by the Chinese economic authorities as what the economy is going to get settled to. But there is one interesting feature about the Chinese economy which cannot be overlooked. The last year was the first time when outward foreign investment from China became higher than the amount of investment that was coming into China. Now, China has been a capital exporter for a long time, but this was for the first year when it actually became a net capital exporter, in the sense that it's now it's investing much more outside than the world is investing in China. One of the implications of this is the fact that when one looks at the rest of the world in totality, and the fact that markets are shrinking, emerging markets, including markets in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the other parts of Asia, are not producing the kind of growth that is usually associated with them. China itself, as the largest emerging market, is slowing. Then still, at the end of the day, the entire emerging market story gets to be focused on one economy principally, and that is India. The natural corollary of China becoming a net investor in the rest of the world, and the fact that India is producing a higher rate of growth than China, leads to the fact that China would look at India as a destination which would produce high returns on its investment. To Mr. Modi, this was a great opportunity. Why? There's been this enormous talk about trade deficit. How does the trade deficit get corrected? Obviously, India cannot stop imports from China, and India cannot force China to take its exports. The solution lies elsewhere, and the solution lies in more Chinese investments in India, which become export-oriented and serve third country markets, maybe including China, in the reverse end of the value chain. So this was the expectation with which the visit was pegged, that Mr. Modi will try to engage more of the Chinese businesses into investing in India, particularly his signature Make in India initiative. And there was a considerable amount of bullishness on this because just before the visit, within a month, there was a significant development. The Chinese handphone manufacturer Xiaomi announced an investment in India, which would have India's most respected industry name, that of the Tatas, as a major stakeholder. At the same time, there was also the information that China's latest business sensation, the Alibaba and Jack Ma, are looking very closely at India's e-commerce market and connecting with Paytm and other e-commerce developers in India to come in force. Now, all these built a hype around the visit, that the visit would produce a sustained flow of capital from the Chinese side into the Indian side. Did it happen? It didn't happen. It didn't happen because this hype was misplaced. The visit was not supposed to sign deals promising investment. But what Mr. Modi came back with out of the 24 agreements that were signed, there were 3 which were significant. And I think these 3 actually fit well with the long-term economic vision that India has. The first, a hardly talked about announcement that China and India would be cooperating in the field of vocational education and skills development in the establishment of the Mahatma Gandhi Skills Foundation and University in India. Well, skills have been a top driver of Mr. Modi's supply side policy for India. He stuck to that, engaged the Chinese, and the Chinese responded. The second, establishment of a trade negotiations committee, which has been widely reported in the media. To me, nobody knows what the trade negotiations committee is supposed to do. And I would take this as Mr. Modi's response to his domestic constituency, who wanted him to take an aggressive position on the trade deficit. If this trade negotiations committee can at least correct a couple of facilitation issues, including the fact that Indian pharmaceuticals can get to have a slightly more liberal standard regime when they enter China, then it would make a considerable breakthrough. But the fact of the matter is, this is a high expectation because this would amount to China changing its domestic policy on standards. It is not the Indian pharmaceuticals which are facing this problem. There are a variety of pharma exporters into China which face a similar problem. The unfortunate part was that in the run-up to the visit, the Indian authorities were characteristic in the hesitation, which they have always displayed before these visits in the past. For example, over here, the Indian Foreign Ministry and the Tourism Ministry were fighting hard with the Home Ministry to ensure that Mr. Modi gets to announce electronic visas on arrival for Chinese tourists. Now, the fact of the matter is that it's not reciprocation that is important. What is important is that Chinese tourists are now the largest number of tourists in the world, and they spend the most when they travel in the world. This is clearly established by the studies that have come out of international tourism organizations. So for a country like India, where tourism doesn't even cover up to 1% of GDP, and there is this tall talk about incredible India, it is very important to draw more Chinese tourists, and electronic visas are important. It really doesn't matter whether China gives electronic visas to Indian tourists or not, because in a sense, it is more important for India to get to that level of tourism collection than China does. What I would gather was at least the establishment of a trajectory, and this is where I come to my final point, is that Mr. Modi succeeded in plugging China into a larger vision of what he is beginning to articulate, much more through his actions rather than any specific policy statements. The fact that India is looking for the first time at China with a cohesive policy, which is also part of a broader regional policy. One can call it the Act-East policy. One can call it the upgraded version of the Look-East policy. But to me, this is a policy which shows a foreign policy being driven very firmly by economic imperatives, where China becomes an extremely necessary part of a regional vision, along with Japan, along with Korea, and other countries which to that extent have never fitted into this. Because when people talk about the Lucas policy of India, the discussion stops at Southeast Asia. And there has never been a recognition of the fact that Southeast Asia cannot be looked in isolation. Because Southeast Asia is probably the most economically integrated region of the world, with Northeast Asia and Asia Pacific. The good part is that realization has come into this because Mr. Modi's pitch was consistent. When he traveled across the region, he tried to sell Make in India as much as possible. The results will be visible over the next 2 to 3 years, if at all he has been successful in doing so or not. He took the right decisions by ensuring that India is playing ball with China when it comes to regional collaboration by announcing the chief of the new development bank of the BRICS a week before he went to China. Mr. K.V. Kamath is now the head of the BRICS bank in China. And he also ensured that India at no stage plays a spoiler when it comes to initiatives being spearheaded by China, like the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the New Development Bank, and even the One Belt, One Route policy initiative, which Dr. Chaudhary mentioned. I would put this visit to conclude as a visit which should be looked at in totality, as part of the Modi government's foreign policy, which is very strongly and very focusedly an economic diplomacy and economic engagement policy. And China is a part of this policy. China is not being looked in isolation. China is a part of this larger policy framework, and hence, whatever conclusions we draw from this visit in terms of its outcomes should be looked at in the context of this larger perspective. Thank you.
Dr. Palit, thank you very much. Just like Dr. Chaudhary before you, you bring a hands-on experience to analysis, having been in your previous avatar a member of the Finance Ministry of India. I would now invite Dr. Sindar Pal Singh, Senior Research Fellow at this institute, to make his presentation.
Thanks, Professor Mitra. 7 minutes. Okay, let me just start with a few qualifications. A task like this is somewhat difficult because doing analysis or visits, on some level, you have very little material to work with, right? So a lot of this is performative. He wore this shirt, he wore these trousers, he wore these shoes, he went here, he went there. And so 2 ways of doing it. One is just, sort of rattling off what was signed, what was agreed. And then the second level is saying, what can you extrapolate from what they signed and what they did? And most of this stuff is available anyway. So to try to value add to this kind of analysis is not an easy task. Nonetheless, I'm going to try. I've been tasked with talking about the implications of the visit for regional and global matters. So my colleague, Mr. Surya, is going to talk about the strictly bilateral. So I am going to speak about supposedly the regional and the global implications. I have, in true Singapore style, I have 3 points to make. The first one is this: if you open up the newspapers and you read about India and China, or just read about regional politics, this word always comes up, balancing. I think some people don't even know what it means anymore. It's one of those words that people use repeatedly, that after a while people just assume they know what it means, but they don't actually necessarily know what it means. So just quickly, let me just say that the word balancing comes from within the IR literature. And so balancing in its very strict sense means if someone is too strong, then you get other people who are not as strong as that person to try to make sure that the strong person doesn't make you do things that you otherwise don't want to do. Then the IR literature comes out another term called bandwagoning, which is the supposedly opposite impulse. Someone is strong, I think I better join him, so when he makes other people do things that they don't want to do, I also can make other people do things that I want them to do. However, reality is somewhat more complex than just balancing and bandwagoning. There's a huge continuum, right? So the continuum is it depends on first time. So during which period are you talking about? And across issues as well, right? So international politics is much more complex than saying, oh, India balances China, or India and China are bandwagoning against the US, right? So when I take this visit, I think one thing is very apparent is that there was one line in, I think either it was this, that Modi said, we must ensure that our relationships with other countries do not become a source of concern for each other. It's a very telling line though. I mean, obviously the clear reference was to Pakistan's relationship with China. And I think the signal here is that, and what's he been doing before he went to China and after he went to China, is to demonstrate that regionally, India will be very willing to build relationships with China's neighbors, especially those neighbors that do not share a very good relationship with China. Japan and Vietnam are very obvious examples, but South Korea, I think he signed a pact with Mongolia as well just after going to China. So I think that's the first point, that if you're looking for a shift, I think this is not really a shift, but you're looking for a slight nuance in terms of foreign policy difference. The first is, you want to call it balancing. Some people use the word soft balancing. The term has become so ridiculous that you need to qualify it further and further. But if you want the term called soft balancing, as in I will become closer to the countries around you who don't really like you very much. This is a slight shift. I think the earlier governments were slightly more reluctant to do something like that. Second point, in a sense, follow on from my colleague Dr. Palit's point. Again, if you read mainstream journalists' analysis of events like the Modi visit, there's always a binary. Is it economics or is it security? And I think sometimes the binary doesn't really help us. Because if you look at, and I think following on from Dr. Palit's point, the point here is that I think this, and this is not unique to Modi, earlier government realized this as well. The argument that you must cooperate economically so that you get along strategically is not always true, right? You can get along economically and not get along strategically. The China-Taiwan example is an excellent example, right? So they get along very well economically. There are some problems. I think the Taiwan's legislature is not sure about passing a trade pact, I think. But by and large, so you always hear this argument in the literature. And the problem is that we are burdened by the European experience, right? Because the European experience was, after the Second World War, they all started to get along, the theory of functionalism, and then you start doing things with each other, and then you trade, and then you become the best of friends until a point where you cannot conceive that a European country will attack another European country. The problem there, again, I think, is that that model is not applicable to the rest of the world. And then we are, again, bogged down by standards elsewhere. So basically the point I'm making here is that this government realizes that as part of its economic diplomacy, if there are positions which it can take in tandem with China, globally and regionally, it will. It does not mean they think, first, they must trade off their security concerns just to get something economically. Two, it does not mean that they believe that if we can do things economically together, we will get along strategically. I don't think they think that. I think they worry about the medium-term security strategic situation with China. Third point, the US question. Of course, the US always looms large when you talk about India and China. You keep hearing, I think, you keep overhearing, and especially in Singapore, this term Asian century all the time. Right? The rise of Asia, the Asian century. And then I think people like Modi and even the Chinese premier sometimes give lip service to it. India and China together will grow. And I mean, if you just scratch the surface a bit, you realize that this Asian century does not depend on India and China cooperating in terms of security relations. It does not. And I think one reason why, the one reason why, I will tell you why. One is, this government, I think, more and more will demonstrate that it is very willing to become a very, very close friend, strategic partner of the United States. Why? Because you look at it ideologically, it's not burdened like the Congress government with the non-alignment mantra that the Congress government had. Because it's very difficult for someone like Manmohan Singh to say that non-alignment was, excuse my French, rubbish, right? He can't. But this government can. It's not burdened by that. Having said that, of course, I think the first question that will come from somebody in the audience say, no, India will never become an ally of the US. No, they won't. But the issue here is that the embedded anti-Americanism that Congress governments had, the Modi government does not have. So that's an advantage. And I think moving forward, this government will increasingly not hesitate to cement closer ties to the US. Because if you look at it, there's hardly I find it difficult, maybe in the discussion it might come up, I find it difficult to think why India and the US, strategically speaking, cannot go closer and closer. I cannot think of any major hindrance to a relationship. I'm sticking my neck out here, so obviously people will come at me later. And also I think ideologically it's damn interesting, and this is some of the work that I've done before. See, for the BJP worldview, China has always been a greater threat than the US, right? I mean, when India did the nuclear bomb, the Vajpayee said it was because of China. Some people say, no, that was for public consumption, whatever. But if you look ideologically, the US, and again, I'm going to be controversial here, I'm going to stick my neck out. On some level, the BJP's vision of India is for India to be like the US. Why should we be ashamed of saying we want power and use that power to influence other people to become a major power in international politics? Why are we burdened with non-alignment mantra, Gandhian politics? Why can't we be like the US, a normal superpower that makes other people do things that it wants it to do? There's nothing wrong with that. This is the kind of ideological outlook. So on that note, I think, therefore, cooperation with the US, again, is win-win. And even better because the Americans fear China. So this is an excellent opportunity if you look at it from the BJP point of view. So these are my 3 points, stuck my neck out a bit just to make it fun later on. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sindapal Singh. You have taken my breath away because I've always thought of you as a man of perceptions. Today, all I've heard is power. So more about that in the discussion. Our last speaker today is Mr. Suryanarayana, who was a professional journalist in his previous life, and in the current one, he states some judgment on other journalists. He's also the editor of our current affairs, and I'm engaging him day and night on insights and briefings about South Asia, and he was one of the one of the key elements in getting the first symposium of papers out on the Modi's China visit. The floor is yours now, Surya.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, it is a given that India-China relations will always be a matter of controversy, a matter of checker relationship, a matter of perhaps going forward colorful relationships as well. So let me begin with Mao, who is more popular in India these days than in China, with Maoism being well known in India. Mao, of course, is known in China still as an icon, but only as an icon on the wall, on the Great Wall of China perhaps, but certainly in Tiananmen Square. So when Xi Jinping received Modi in Xi'an, the hometown of Xi Jinping, which itself was a new departure for a Chinese leader to have invited a foreign dignitary outside of Beijing for both an excursion and also for enlightening discussions. So Xi Jinping told Modi, of course, Modi perhaps could become India's Mao. That's a controversial remark. So Xi Jinping told Modi that Mao had said long ago that 10,000 years is too long a period in history. Therefore, we, China and India, don't have to wait for 10,000 years to have really good relationship. Then Modi, of course, had come with a great expectation that his all-weather dialogue with China will continue to flourish. And this all-weather dialogue had started in 2013 when Premier Li Keqiang visited New Delhi, when Manmohan Singh was still the Prime Minister of India. At that time, they had met in the shadow of a military confrontation, if eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation between the two sides on the disputed border, but there was no firefight as such. And that particular event later helped the two sides to develop a framework of dialogue which could be described as all-weather dialogue. And this continued in 2014 September, when Xi Jinping visited Modi in Delhi. And this time round, there was really a confrontation at the same time along the disputed border. Earlier in 2013, the confrontation or the face-off had been defused before Li Keqiang touched down in Delhi. But this time it was coincidental with the visit by Xi Jinping to Delhi. And yet the two sides carried on merrily with their talks. There was no breakdown. And therefore Modi was keen to ensure that there should be no further breakdown of talks between India and China. And then Modi, when he listened to Xi Jinping's remarks about Mao, obviously Modi being a pragmatist, realized that there should be something in return for Xi Jinping to mull over. So he said Xi Jinping should realize that China will have to reconsider its approach towards India. This can mean many things. This is an officially quoted statement by Modi as something which Modi is said to have told Xi Jinping in the private discussions. And then Xi Jinping continued and said that, well, 10,000 years, of course, is too long a period. Therefore, let us, I'm quoting, seize the day and seize the hour. And that is the context in which the talks began, although there was an external context as well. And that was as Modi arrived in Xi Jinping's hometown for what probably he thought would be a touchdown for friendship. Right at that particular moment, the Chinese state television showed images of Indian map, which India, of course, saw it as a truncated map of India. And therefore, one would have expected Modi to have already lost steam or lost some momentum, yet he didn't do that for two reasons. One, of course, China depicting what India regards as a truncated map of India is not really all that new, although it happened at the time when Modi landed in Xi'an for the talks with Xi Jinping. And moreover, when Xi Jinping said, seize the day and seize the hour, obviously in political terms, it was a cloudy day because of the map issue. And it was in that context that the two sides decided not to have a breakdown of talks. Because for Xi Jinping, obviously, he wants to rule the world, if not today, perhaps before he calls it a day. Whereas Modi certainly has no such ambitions. He wants to rule India for as long as he can before he calls it a day. And therefore, there was some meeting ground in a sense that India was not really challenging China in global terms. And Xi Jinping's One Belt, One Road initiative, which has already been referred to, is and can be seen as one of his grand visions or designs to rule the world one day when America will be a declining power. Of course, I do agree with Dr. Sindhapal that America will not disappear all that soon, and India will have to reckon with the fact that to match China in some ways, to at least to cut down on the asymmetry between India and China, Modi will have to think in terms of building better relations, better strategic relations with the US. So in that overall context of the US as a factor in the background, and with Modi's ambitions being limited to India, which has been admirably explained to us by Dr. Amit Yendu in economic terms, And with Xi Jinping having the grander vision of ruling the world at some stage in the future, the talks centered on some of the key issues, the bilateral issues. And one of them obviously was the border issue. And one of the earlier mantras in discussions between India and China on the border issue has been, we should have an early settlement. This has been going on for quite some time. And this emphasis on early settlement has been there without any real forward movement towards that early date. This time they narrowed it further down to say that as early as possible. And they also added, for good measure, that this will be a strategic objective for the two countries going forward. But obviously, what is lacking is the political will to settle the border issue. We have so many, we meaning India and China, have so many CBMs in place, beginning with 1993, and I can reel off 1996, 2003, 2005, 2012, 2013. 2013 was the latest Border Defense Cooperation Agreement, which is something like a code of conduct for the two armed forces who are facing each other on a day-to-day basis along the line of actual control in the disputed border region. And the line of actual control is not really delineated and is not demarcated, and therefore there is a big dispute about where the line of actual control actually runs from and where it ends. So in that context, one should imagine that there should have been much more forward movement on the border issue, but they settled for what was possible in the circumstances, they meaning Xi and Modi. And this was the same theme in the discussions the next day between Modi and Premier Li Keqiang in Beijing. The one and only aspect, new aspect, relatively speaking, on the border issue and therefore the related military issue is the agreement to establish a hotline between the military headquarters of the two countries. But no timeline has been set for when this hotline will be set up. And on the broader issue of border settlement, there are ever so many theories, both in international relations theory and as well in practical propositions, that when there is a mutually hurting stalemate between any two countries with a border dispute, or for that matter any dispute, they may be more willing to settle the issue. And the mutually hurting stalemate has been there in reference to China and India for quite some time, quite a number of years, almost since 1962. But no forward movement has taken place since then for a variety of reasons, which of course we don't have time to go into right now. So what I would imagine is, it is possible for the two sides to settle the border dispute only when they realize at the same time that the cost of not settling the border dispute will outweigh the cost of settling it on a win-win basis, which would mean two-way compromises or two-way concessions. What would those concessions be, and what would that compromise, two-way compromise could be, of course, is a matter to be decided by the special representatives who are discussing this issue regularly. 18 to 19 meetings have already been held between the two special representatives. And the border issue is indirectly and directly related to the question of Tibet, which all of us in the audience, I'm sure, are aware of, and the issue of Dalai Lama and whether Dalai Lama will live long enough, and the new, relatively new issue of Tawang, which is part of Arunachal Pradesh in Indian state, which of course China claims as China's southern Tibet and therefore part of China. So these are all issues on the political side, whereas on the strategic side, the border dispute can be settled, as I said, in the overall framework of what could be the pluses and negatives of settlement at a given time, whether the cost of settling or the cost of not settling outweighs the cost of settling through a compromise. Within this overall framework, there has to be some kind of forward movement, at least on some other issues. Therefore, there could be some additional momentum towards confidence building other than the mere military-related confidence building measures which have been enunciated. I mentioned any number of, I think 6 or 7 are there. One of those issues, of course, is the Brahmaputra river waters, which is at the moment not a big dispute because India tends to give China the benefit of the doubt that the planned diversion of the Brahmaputra waters within Tibet towards northern China, that planned diversion is still supposed to be a matter not of that eminent importance, both for China and for India in terms of a negativity. Also, it is recognized by India that China perhaps is building whatever it has so far built, in a manner of speaking, the run-of-the-river dam process, which is supposed to be not really all that dangerous for India at the moment. But it may become jolly well, of course, is not the term, right term in this context, which may well become a dispute in the future. And within the context of what was originally decided upon in 2005 between India and China as strategic and cooperative partnership between the two countries, that word has gone missing this time, for the first time since 2005. So many people were wondering what's happening. And one of the reasons is that China hasn't done that with Pakistan as well. Pakistan and China entered into what is known as a treaty, a firm treaty, not just a statement, in 2005. And China this time does not refer to the treaty either when Xi Jinping visited Islamabad in April 2015. Therefore, it could be taken as some kind of, not a downgrading of relations between China and India. And the new mantra in this context is closer developmental partnership, which of course Dr. Amitendu has been touching upon. And one more additional, this time it's an additional injection of a political term. China and India have regarded each other as a major power, perhaps for the first time, at least that is the take, insofar as one could look at the documents. If that is the case, if China is willing to really regard India as a major power going forward, the questions to be asked are, is this because India and China may find that there will be a new dynamic because of the US factor, US coming closer to India and vice versa? This has been happening. The latest defense agreement between defense cooperation and technology development agreement between US and India is a pointer in that direction. But China doesn't seem to give in to India on any of its aspirations, like UN Security Council permanent membership or even the nuclear suppliers group. Overall, taking the broader region, East Asia as well as South Asia, with Pakistan being a factor in China-India relations, and with the US perhaps going to be a key factor going forward in the Sino-Indian relations. The two countries, China and India, have started thinking in terms of new forms of cooperation. They have been mentioning a new area of cooperation, such as outer space, for whatever it is worth, more so after India had a successful mission to the Mars, and China had a successful mission to the moon. And one more factor of importance to India, both in strategic terms and in economic terms, is China's willingness to consider cooperating with India in the civil nuclear domain. And the Chinese have been saying that this will help the Chinese companies to sell civil nuclear reactors to Indian power plants. And there is also a softer side to Indo-Chinese, or rather Chinese-Indian diplomacy, such as, Modi was able to convince the Chinese to open a new route to Mansarovar for Kailash Yatra. And there could be, going forward, more such soft diplomacy aspects, some of which Dr. Amityendu referred to as e-visas. And also new consulates will be opened, one of course in Chennai and the other in Chengdu. And sister states and sister cities have been identified. Therefore, on balance, it's a relationship in absolute flux. It's a relationship which the two don't want to give up in a hurry just because of some irritants, either because of Pakistan for India or because of US for China. So I think it could still be a win-win relationship going forward, and what Modi would refer to as a developmental partnership. Thank you.